All right, guys, so last week we left off on page 9. Scroll down to page 10, and that's where we're starting today, paragraph 43. Richard was alone in Caprice Wilson's office the next day when the police came to arrest him. He had been trying to speak with her all morning, even calling her from class, but Wilson asked him to wait until he had a break. She was on her way to meet him when she saw him being led away in handcuffs. At the police station, officers Anwan Jones and Jason Anderson placed Richard in an interview room and left him there. A video shows Richard sitting by himself. An officer returns at one point to hand him a bag lunch. Richard unpacks a soda, a sandwich, and a bag of chips. He smooths the paper bag flat and places the sandwich on top. Then he folds his hands and bows his head. He crosses himself 3 times, then he begins to eat his lunch. When the police officers return, he has his head down on the table. "You didn't eat all your chips?" Officer Jones asks. Richard says, "I was getting a little stomachache." The officers are friendly. They ask questions about Richard's life, where he lives, what sports he plays, how he's doing in school, whether he has a girlfriend. In response, Richard is candid, almost confiding. He tells them about the fight that sent him to the group home, about having a little breakdown after Taranta's murder, about his troubles in school. When they ask about the events of the previous afternoon, Richard tells them that he was on the 57 bus when he saw a man with his skirt on fire. "What do you think about dudes who dress up in skirts?" Officer Jones asks. "I'm not with that," Richard says. "I wouldn't say I hate gay people, but I'm very homophobic." Here's a picture of Richard Thomas on the left with his brother Darion before the attack. Photograph from Jasmine Jackson. Jones nods. "Okay, why would you call yourself homophobic?" "I don't have no problem with somebody if they like men. But if you do too much, nobody cares really." "Do too much?" "Taking it to the next level," Richard explains. Jones asks for an example. "Cross-dressing, and some people, they try to make everybody know that they are that." After asking Richard to go through the events on the bus a couple of times, the police reveal that they have video of the incident. They know he did it. They just want him to tell them why. "Being stupid," Richard says, his voice low. "What would even remotely make you think about setting something on fire like that, someone's clothing?" Anderson asks. "Was it because the dude was wearing a dress? Did you have a problem with him?" "I don't know." "People do things for a reason," the officer says. "We've all made decisions in life that may not have been the best choice to make at a given time. What we're trying to figure out is why this happened." "I'm homophobic," Richard says at last. "I don't like gay people." "Did you get angry because he's a gay dude in a skirt? Not just being gay, but, quote, doing too much?" Jones asks. "Actually, I didn't know that his skirt was going to do that it was going to catch like that," Richard says. "It was like a little flame. I thought it was just going to go out." But it was too late to backpedal. 2 days after Richard's arrest, the Alameda County District Attorney announced the charges: aggravated mayhem and assault with intent to cause great bodily injury, both felonies, each with a hate crime clause that would add an additional 1 to 3 years in state prison to his sentence. If convicted, Thomas faced a maximum sentence of life in prison, a punishment he would never have faced had he been charged as a juvenile. Jamal, the boy who handed Richard the lighter, was never interviewed, arrested, or charged. On November 8th, 4 days after lighting Sasha's skirt on fire, Richard wrote the teenager a letter. "Dear victim," it began, "I apologize for my actions, for the pain that I brought to you and your family. I was wrong for what I did. I was wrong. I had no reason to do that to you. I don't know what was going through my head at the time. I'm not a monster. I have a big heart. I never even thought of hurting anyone like the way I hurt you. I just wanted you to know that I'm deeply sorry for my actions. I think about what happened every second. I pray that you heal correctly and that you recover and live a happy life. Please forgive me. That's all I want. I take responsibility for all my actions. I'll take all the consequences," he wrote. "I'm not just saying this because I'm incarcerated. I honestly mean every word. He signed it, Love, Richard Thomas. A few days later, he wrote a second letter, this one addressed to Mr. Fleischman. It was nearly 3 pages long, written in neat cursive. I had a nightmare last night and I woke up sweating and apologizing, he wrote. I really hope you get back to the way you were. I went to court yesterday and they're still making me seem like a monster, but I'm not. I'm a good kid if you get to know me. I'm sure you would have been a nice person too, he continued. I was hoping that I can meet you face to face so I can apologize to you. He went on to detail the charges against him, explaining that he was willing to accept the assault charges, but that he rejected the hate crime enhancements. I don't have a problem with homosexuals, he explained. I have friends that's homosexuals, and we never had problems, so I don't look at you wrong because of your sexuality. Honestly, I could care less if you like men. You weren't trying to talk to me in that way. As for himself, he said, I'm not a thug, gangster, hoodlum, nor monster. I'm a young African-American male who's made a terrible mistake. Perhaps, he suggested, he and Fleischman had things in common. I've also been hurt a lot for no reason. Not like I hurt you, but I've been hurt physically and mentally, so I know how it feels. The pain and the confusion of why me. I felt it before plenty of times. William Dubois put the letters in his briefcase. Because they contained admissions of guilt, he felt he couldn't send them to Sasha until after the case was resolved. It would be 14 months before Sasha read them. When Sasha arrived home from the hospital on November 27th, 23 days after the attack, it was to a street crowded with reporters and photographers. There had been a march along the route of the 57 bus, with supporters tying rainbow-colored ribbons to street signs and telephone poles along the way. Cards, letters, and packages poured in, including some from Canada. An online medical fund raised $31,000 in donations. Several high schools had sponsored skirt-wearing days, so did a local bookstore. At Oakland High, Richard's school, the varsity basketball team wore blue jerseys with Sasha's name on them and the words "No Hate." Sasha gave an interview to a local news station, wearing a skirt over bandaged legs. I was really excited that an agender person was in the news, Sasha explained to me later. But I wasn't that excited about the circumstances, obviously. Those were my feelings. This is really great, but does it have to be me? Sasha acknowledged feeling angry sometimes. While the long-term prognosis was excellent, everything was more difficult at the moment. Walking, taking a shower, getting dressed. The pain made it hard to sleep. 10 days after Sasha got home from the hospital, the family invited Dan Gale, one of the 2 men who put out the fire, to their house for brunch. The other man was never identified. Toward the end of the meal, the conversation turned to Richard Thomas. Debbie and Carl had told reporters that they wanted to see Richard tried as a juvenile, not as an adult, and they had consistently cautioned against leaping to conclusions about Richard's motivation. Gale, a gravel-voiced construction worker with a walrus mustache, remarked that he thought Sasha's parents showed more forbearance than he would have. He turned to Sasha. How do you feel on that? I mean, this kid hurt you. Sasha considered this. I know he hurt me, Sasha said. He did something that's really dangerous and stupid. But then again, he's a 16-year-old kid, and 16-year-old kids are kind of dumb. It's really hard to know what I want for him. Jasmine Jackson, Richard's deeply religious mother, tried to believe that everything had happened was part of a larger plan. God is good, she repeated in the courthouse elevator. God is good. God is so good. When Richard was escorted into the courtroom for the many procedural hearings that followed his arrest, Jasmine would catch his eye and make a heart shape with her fingers, pressing it to her chest. She was sure that Richard had learned something from what he did. We're all going to learn something from this, she said frequently. But once, after saying it, she shook her head. I wish it hadn't gone this far, and he could have learned a different way, she said. I wish that the courts would give him a suitable punishment so that he can learn from this instead of just being institutionalized. This was her biggest fear. I want him to have enough time to do something with his life, she said. Everyone I interviewed who knew Richard made a point of telling me that he was not homophobic. Richard had a gay friend, they pointed out, and his mother's cousin is transgender. Dubois wouldn't allow me to interview his client, given the potential sentence. He felt the risks were too great. But he argued that it made no sense to describe a child's still forming opinions as hate. Lynchings. They're hate crimes, he said. But as for a boy wearing a skirt, he went on, the kid who thinks that this is anomalous and decides to play a prank is not committing a hate crime. O'Malley, the district attorney, didn't see it that way. If somebody commits a heinous crime against somebody because they're a member of a protected class, that is very purposeful discrimination, she explained as we sat in her office before a massive wooden desk that belonged to Earl Warren when he was the Alameda County DA. Hate crimes, she argued, were discrimination just as segregation was. It's important to show that this is the kind of behavior that will never be tolerated. Until the mid-1980s, the law made no distinction between crimes motivated by bigotry and crimes motivated by money, passion, or boredom. Murder was murder, vandalism was vandalism. The term hate crime arose in response to what was described at the time as an epidemic of neo-Nazi and skinhead violence, although in retrospect it's unclear whether any such epidemic existed. Since then, the number of bias-motivated prosecutions has steadily declined. In California, a state with close to 39 million people, hate crime prosecutions have fallen 48% since 2003, with just 158 bias crimes filed for prosecution in 2012. A majority of those charged with bias crimes do not fit the stereotype of the squinting, bristle-headed loner sporting a swastika tattoo. Researchers estimate that fewer than 5% are members of an organized hate group. Most are young males, either in their teens or early 20s, acting in a group. In a study of Boston hate crime prosecutions in the early 1990s, 2/3 of the offenders were categorized as thrill-seeking. That is, they were groups of young people looking for some fun at the expense of someone they regarded as lower on the totem pole. The authors of the study found that many of these offenders weren't even particularly biased toward their victims, but were following the lead of a more biased peer. Many hate crimes, according to Phyllis B. Gerstenfeld, a criminal justice professor at California State University Stanislaus, don't have as much to do with the victim as they do with the offender and their own insecurity, which of course is a lot of what's going on with adolescents in general. Two groups that might have been expected to support O'Malley's decision to charge Richard as an adult, the National Center for Lesbian Rights and the Transgender Law Center, wrote to her in November 2013 asking her to reconsider. When juvenile impulsivity and poor judgment produce dire consequences, it does not make sense to craft a response intended for adults, they said in a letter that was also sent on behalf of the ACLU of Northern California. Rather, these are the very different circumstances under which it is important to remember that children are different from adults. The letter concluded, "We firmly believe that you can demonstrate your office's commitment to protecting the victims of hate crimes without imposing adult sanctions on juvenile offenders." Richard's first evidentiary hearing was in March. Sasha took the day off from school and came to court with Carl and Debbie, dressed in a navy blue skirt, a gray vest, a brown striped bow tie, a gray tweed cap, a trench coat, and purple high tops. Richard's mother was there too. She had asked me in February if I could arrange a meeting with Sasha's family, but when I broached the subject with Debbie, she recoiled and said she wasn't ready. Now in the vestibule outside the courtroom, Jasmine, a strikingly pretty woman with almond-shaped eyes and a high round forehead, came forward. "My son's not like that," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't know what made him do that, and I'm sorry. We're not hateful people." Then she hugged each member of the family, Debbie, Carl, Sasha. One by one, each of Richard's relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, came forward and did the same. When it was over, both mothers were crying. Afterward, Jasmine kept talking about Sasha. "He just looks so innocent," she said to me. "He's just so cute. He has such a nice family. He didn't deserve that. No kid does. It's just not something I can get used to." There was so much more that she had wanted to say to them, but she couldn't find the words. I don't know what to say, but sorry, she told me. 7 months later, on the morning of October 16th, Richard sat with his left leg shackled to a wooden chair in the courtroom of Judge Paul DeLucci. He wore a gray, county-issue sweatshirt and khakis, and while he had lost the terrified look of his early court appearances, his eyes were wary. There was a faint peach fuzz mustache on his upper lip. DeLucci's courtroom was frequently crowded and chaotic, with prisoners stacked up in the jury box, listlessly waiting for their turn to appear. But each time Richard came to court, I watched his eyes rove the room, taking everything in. His lawyer had told me he was doing well in Alameda County Juvenile Hall, getting good grades and staying out of trouble. He was on track to graduate from high school in February. Jasmine visited him every Sunday. Jasmine had stopped returning my calls, telling me in July that she was tired of talking about the case, tired of thinking about it, just tired. I work 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, and when I come home, I just want to go to sleep, she said. On that morning, she sat just behind me, wearing new long hair extensions with a greenish tint. Debbie Crandall sat next to me, her eyes fixed on Richard. He was going to take a plea bargain. The mayhem charge and the hate crime enhancements would be dropped, and Richard would receive a 5-year sentence on the assault charge. With credit for time served and good behavior, the deal would have Richard, now 17, released before his 21st birthday, making it more likely that he could serve all his time in juvenile facilities. Dubois had urged Richard to accept it as the best choice among the available alternatives. Debbie and Carl also wanted him to take the deal, so that Sasha, now a freshman at MIT, wouldn't have to fly back for trial. Jasmine wasn't so sure. She had hoped for a better outcome, and communication between her and Dubois had grown increasingly poor over the summer and fall. Now she and Richard had decided to accept the offer. But that morning, the Deputy District Attorney, Richard Moore, abruptly changed the 5-year sentence to 7 years. No explanation was given in court. Take it or go to trial, Dubois said he was told. From my seat in the gallery, I watched Dubois pull a chair in front of Richard to tell him the news. I could see the moment when Richard understood what had happened. He turned his head to look at Jasmine. They stared at each other for a long, heartbreaking moment, seeming to converse without words. When Richard turned back to face Dubois, he curled his head onto his shoulder. He would take the deal. Dubois, a 40-year courthouse veteran, was usually calm and even-tempered. But when I went to talk to him after the hearing, he was furious. Under the terms of the deal, Richard's sentence may still be reduced to 5 years if he meets certain benchmarks between now and July. Full participation in available educational and rehabilitation programs, a clean discipline record. But not all of that is in Richard's control. Another inmate could pick a fight with him. A staff member might write him up for a minor offense. And because minors can be transferred to an adult prison as soon as they turn 18, a longer sentence makes it more likely that Richard will serve the bulk of his time in an adult prison, rather than in juvenile facilities. He's now thrown to the wolves, Dubois told me. Weeks later, he was still fuming about Richard's sentence. It's punitive, he said. And for what? Protecting the community by making this kid into a real gangster? O'Malley had told me over the phone in November that the new arrangement was meant to help him by giving him more time to receive treatment. She could not, however, name the type of treatment programs she had in mind for Richard or explain how sending him to adult prison would serve the rehabilitation goals she had described. Richard returned to court a month later for sentencing. Debbie had been asked to give a victim impact statement. She read aloud a letter to Richard, her voice quavering. "You attacked our child as they slept on a bus," she began. "Maybe you thought it was weird that Sasha was wearing a skirt." Richard's gaze stayed on her face as she described Sasha's ordeal. The charred skin, the painful skin grafts, the hours of daily bandaging. His eyes filled with tears. "We do not understand your actions," Debbie went on, "but we also think that hatred only leads to more hatred and anger. We don't want you to come out of prison full of hate." Debbie and Carl walked out of the courthouse into the November sunshine and stopped for coffee at a nearby sidewalk cafe. They were exhausted from talking to reporters, unsure whether to be relieved or distraught. "I wish it had turned out differently for Richard," Debbie said. "We got Sasha back, but poor Jasmine. She lost her son for years." They hadn't expected to be so moved by seeing Richard's face again. "I just had this wave of emotion at how young he looked," Carl said. "He just looks like a kid."